Welcome back, everyone. In this video, we'll be covering some key moments in Hamlet. Again, you will probably want to have your textbook available, or if you don't have your textbook anymore, then you'll want to have access to some version of Hamlet. Now, in this video, we'll be covering just some key scenes that really give us some insight into some of those big ideas. So first is on page 2421. It's Act 1, Scene 3, lines 55 to 81. Laertes is leaving. Polonius is going to give him some advice. It reads, quote, "Yet here, Laertes, aboard, aboard, for shame! The wind sits in the shoulder of your sail, and you are stayed for. There, my blessing with thee. And these few precepts in thy memory see thou character. Give thy thoughts no tongue, no any unproportioned thought his act. Be thou familiar, but by no means vulgar. Those friends thou hast, and their adoption tried, grapple them to thy soul with hoops of steel, but do not dull thy palm with entertainment of each new-hatched, unfledged comrade. Beware of entrance to a quarrel, but being in, bear it, that the opposed may beware of thee. Give every man thy ear, but few thy voice. Take each man's censure, but reserve thy judgment. Costly thy habit as thy purse can buy, but not expressed in fancy, rich, not gaudy. For the apparel oft proclaims the man, and they in France of the best rank and station are of a most select and generous chief in that. Neither a borrower nor a lender be, for loan oft loses both itself and friend, and borrowing dulls the edge of husbandry. This above all, to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night the day, thou canst not then be false to any man. Farewell. My blessing season this in thee." So in this quote, Polonius is trying to see his son off with as many words of wisdom as he can possibly give to him. And what we see in this scene really is a nice domestic contrast to the troubled royal family, right? So this is, a father and his two children having this sort of tender moment as the son goes off to seek his fortunes in the world. Which is it's a really stark difference to the royal family where, the queen is grieving, the king murdered his brother, the crown prince is just not having a good time. Instead, we get this scene of real tenderness between the three of them. So Polonius here is trying to help his son be successful. A lot of his advice is, neither a borrower nor a lender be, dress well, in quality clothing that isn't like fancy, make friends wisely, listen to people, but, don't talk too much, just like general advice about how to be like a successful adult human. But there's really deep irony here, as we'll come to know throughout the play, because Polonius can't take any of his own advice. He talks all the time, he is kind of like he's always offering his counsel when it's not asked for. He kind of doesn't seem to think before he speaks sometimes. And also, when he says, "This above all, to thine own self be true," Polonius doesn't do that. Polonius is just kind of constantly serving other people and acting in a very servile fashion. So there is some irony here in that, Polonius is giving advice that he himself can't take. But at the same time, if you notice the way that Shakespeare structures this text, you'll notice that, there's no kind of commentary being made on Polonius. The phrasing is so straightforward that it's not calling attention to its own irony. It's not, really calling attention to Polonius's maybe hypocrisy. It's just very straightforward. And so because of this really straightforward tone in this speech, we're kind of allowed to make of this speech what we want to. And one of the things that this really brings up is this concept of Polonius as a character, as a person, as a human, right? Is he a sympathetic character? He often acts against his own best interests. He often acts in ways that are not super dignified. ultimately he dies because he's snooping on the queen and Hamlet. But this scene shows us another side of Polonius, that he really is trying to maybe be a good father in the best way he can. So, with that in mind, all of that, how sympathetic do you find Polonius? How clever do you think he is? How buffoonish do you think he is? What do you make of this guy? Next scene. Act 2, Scene 2, lines 501 to 560. Now, this is the scene where Hamlet has just watched a play with Polonius. He is sitting next to Polonius. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern have been around. And this group of traveling players comes to perform a play based on the Aeneid. Now, we didn't read the Aeneid in class, but we talked about it. It's that Roman epic where it's supposed to be like a sequel to the Iliad, where, Aeneas takes his father and his son to, ultimately found Britain, essentially. To ultimately found Rome, and then Britain along the way. And so Hamlet has been watching these actors, and he has a little bit of an epiphany. Here's what Hamlet says. Now I am alone. Oh, what a rogue and peasant slave am I. Is it not monstrous that this player here, but in a fiction, in a dream of passion, could force his soul so to his own conceit that from her working all his visage wan, tears in his eyes, distraction in his aspect, broken voice, and his whole function suiting with forms to his conceit, and all for nothing, for Hecuba. What's Hecuba to him, or he to Hecuba that he should weep for her? What would he do, had he the motive and the cue for passion that I have? He would drown the stage with tears, and cleave the general air with horrid speech, make mad the guilty, and appall the free, confound the ignorant, and amaze indeed the very faculties of eyes and ears. Yet I, a dull and muddy-mettled rascal, peak, like John o' Dreams, unpregnant of my cause, and can say nothing. No, not for a king upon whose property and most dear life a damned defeat was made. Am I a coward? Calls me villain, breaks my pate across, plucks off my beard and blows it in my face, tweaks me by the nose, give me lie in the throat, as deep as to the lungs. Who does me this? Ha! Swins, I should take it. For it cannot be that I am pigeon-livered and lack gall to make oppression bitter. Or ere this, I should have fatted all the region kites with this slave's offal. Bloody, bawdy villain! Remorseless, treacherous, lecherous, kindless villain! Oh, vengeance! Oh. Why, what an ass I am! This is most brave, that I, the son of a dear father murdered, prompted to my revenge by heaven and hell, must, like a whore, unpack my heart with words, and fall a-cursing like a very drab, a scullion. Fie upon it! About my brain. I have heard that guilty creatures sitting at a play have by the very cunning of the scene been struck so to the soul that presently they have proclaimed their malefactions. For murder, though it have no tongue, will speak with most miraculous organ. I'll have these players play something like the murder of my father before mine uncle. I'll observe his looks, tempt him to the quick. If he but blench, I'll know my course. The spirit that I have seen may be the devil, and the devil hath power to assume a pleasing shape, yea, and perhaps out of my weakness and my melancholy, as he is very potent with such spirits, abuses me to damn me. Now, I'll have more grounds more relative than this. The play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. So in this scene, Hamlet is obviously somewhat undone by the power of the players on the stage. He's thinking about the power of performance. So he also may be a little bit struck by the content of the play, because this is the part of the Aeneid where Achilles' son Pyrrhus is about to kill Priam as an act of vengeance. So he's already thinking about murder and fathers and sons and all this. And so throughout this text, Hamlet is berating himself, because he's saying essentially that the players do such a good job pretending to have these emotions, right? They don't feel any of these emotions truly, but they can force themselves to feel emotions so strongly that they have a physical response, right? They cry. They don't cry because they're actually, sad because someone they love has died. They are crying because they are forcing themselves to play the part. And Hamlet is really amazed that they have this control over themselves without having genuine motivation. While Hamlet feels like he has no motivation or no control over his actions, even though he has all the motivation in the world. He feels like he should be able to carry out the physical expression of his motivations. And he feels sort of dreadful. He calls himself an ass. He calls himself a dull and muddy-mettled rascal. He calls himself all of these terrible names because he doesn't understand why he can't just make himself act. And so when he sees this play, on the one hand, he's really hard on himself for not being able to act on his motivation in the way that he sees these actors doing it. But on the other hand, he realizes that the power of fiction is such that it can have real, genuine effects on its viewers. He realizes that the power of fiction is such that if someone sees a story told well, and especially if the story is one that is, near and dear to their own experience in the way that this play has been for him, that it can create a real impact, right? He's recognizing the power of fiction in this section just as much as he's recognizing sort of the power of performance, and as much as he is berating his own inability to act. And so he decides that he is going to put on a play that matches the murder of his father to see if Claudius will react. And his way of thinking is that if Claudius has a negative emotional response to this play, then that will prove his guilt. So in this text, here's the question for you. Do you feel that Hamlet is correct in ascribing so much power to performance? And not just performance in the sense of performing a play, but performance in the sense of identity as performance. We perform who we are. We are the person that we act like. So what do you think? Do you think that Hamlet is correct in ascribing so much power to performance? Similarly, but a different question, do you think that Hamlet is correct in ascribing so much power to fiction? Right? Do you really think that fictional stories can have that kind of profound effect on our genuine human emotions? Let's move on to the third scene. This is Act 3, Scene 1, lines 64 to 98. And this is, this is the big one. And I'm going to butcher it because I'm not a professional actor. But I will give it my best. Here we go. To be or not to be? That is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them, to die, to sleep, no more, and by a sleep to say we end the heartache, and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished, to die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil? It must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make with bare bodkin. Who would fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. Thus conscience does make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pitch and moment with this regard their currents turn awry and lose the name of action. Soft you now, the fair Ophelia, nymph, in thy orisons be all my sins remembered. So this chunk of text is like, if Hamlet is, one of the most famous texts in the English language, this excerpt is one of the most famous pieces of that text. And we talk a lot about how Hamlet seems to be debating whether or not death is worth it. And that's true. On some levels, Hamlet is doing that. But it also kind of begs the question, like, he says to be or not to be, that's the question. What is the question? Is he contemplating suicide? Is he contemplating life more generally? Is he contemplating death more generally? There are just as many interpretations of this passage as there are any other passage in the play. There's no right answer here. It is, we know, just an incredibly existentialist discussion, contrasting the worthiness of life's struggle to the seeming nobility of death. He talks again and again about how difficult life is, right? We end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. Calamity of so long life, the whips and scorns of time, the pangs of despised love, a weary life. And so, he says, makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. So he keeps coming back to the sense that, like, life is really hard. Life is full of danger and distress and disappointment and pain. And he's sort of contrasting that to thinking about what death means by contrast. So, on the one hand, life for Hamlet is full of injustice and inaction. His life especially, right? He feels trapped by his life. He feels like his life is full of injustices that he cannot right. He feels, bad that he is not taking any action against them. He said, he's thinking here that death maybe, perhaps suicide would at least be a decisive action, right? Or when he says, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them, right? Is it more decisive to just end his life and have done with it? But on the other hand, death is an action, but it's one that precludes all other actions. Death is an end to all of these other actions. It doesn't solve his problems. It just removes him from the equation. Right? His problems wouldn't end. He would. So you can also read this as sort of thinking about, like, well, wouldn't it be nice to die and just not have to worry about my problems anymore? You can also read this as a very kind of like encouraging thought, that sense of like, well, if I die, my problems won't end, but I won't have a chance to fix them anymore. And, there are some really interesting pieces of language here, in terms of the way that he's thinking about life and death, in this sense of like, is death a worthy action in the face of inaction? Is death a worthy solution? Is it a noble solution? Or is it better to keep struggling in what feels like an uphill battle. If we look in line 75, we get, again, just to focus on some of the language specifically, he uses this word quietus. Now, quietus is a legal term from the time that means to put one's affairs in order. So when he says, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin, a bodkin means a knife. So thinking about, when he himself might put his affairs in order with a knife by killing himself. But quietus is also, obviously, it's the word quiet, right? That sense of peace, of silence, of rest. And he comes back to that again and again when he thinks about like to die, to sleep perchance to dream, the sleep of death. That is something that we hear a lot in religious circumstances. Often when we say someone has died, we say that they're asleep. And so he's using this language that is very gentle. He seems like a tired character in this moment. He seems exhausted. It seems like maybe what he doesn't need so much is a way out of his problems, so much as just maybe like one really, really, really good night's sleep. Which is, putting too casual of a point on it. But he also discusses, when he discusses the sense of like death and sleep, he's also bringing up, again, some of these religious considerations, right? In a time when suicide is considered to be a grave sin that will get you sent to hell, if he's thinking about what happens after death, he says, nobody actually knows what happens after death. It's the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. Nobody comes back from death. We don't know what happens. And so he says, he's grappling with this sense of like existentialism and judgment. That thought of, death is just like sleep. It would be nice maybe to die, but we don't know what happens after death. We don't know if we'll be punished. We don't know if we'll be, just resting forever. He doesn't know. And so he's thinking about this sense of existentialism in the sense that, maybe it's better to continue to face what life has to offer us than it is to die not knowing what will happen after death. So again, that sense of existentialism, that sense of we're going to carry on anyway. Even if life is absurd, even if life is meaningless, we have to carry on. Paired with that sense of kind of religious anxiety about if I die, if I commit suicide, will I be damned forever? What happens after death? And thinking about all of this in really vague general language. At no point here, Hamlet often, for most of this, uses first person plural. We, us, etc. But the way that he uses we and us is not the royal we. It's not the, we would like you to come to our birthday party kind of we. If you look in, lines like when he says, something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. And then a couple lines later he says, thus conscience does make cowards of us all. And then earlier in the text, he doesn't even say we until, line 60. And a lot of this is very kind of vague general language. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, when he himself might his quietus make? And so this vague general language that he's using, he could be saying something like, to die, to sleep no more, and by a sleep to say, I end my heartache. He doesn't say that. He says, and by a sleep to say, we end the heartache, and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. So if we're thinking about whether, how suicidal is Hamlet here? That's the big question in this. Is he actively desiring an end to his life? Or is he trying to contemplate his kind of really thorny problems from as many angles as possible? Is he sort of generally wishing that there would be some kind of end to his anguish? Is he thinking about death because he's experienced so much of it lately? Is he thinking about death because he would like to die, but he's afraid of what happens afterward? I would personally argue that perhaps this vague general language is one of the things that prevents this from really reading convincingly as, Hamlet actively contemplating suicide. Because it is so general, it does seem like a more general contemplation, to me at least. Your mileage will vary. Not may vary, your mileage will vary. But either way, this is a really complex piece that is really speaking to these interconnected strands of grief and death and loss and inaction and existentialism and religious anxiety and even this sense of kind of humanist strains of thought wherein we are actively trying to know more about ourselves and the world around us, but that death is sort of like that great dark curtain beyond which we cannot see. So think about kind of some of these questions as you contemplate this sort of most iconic of Shakespearean moments. And we'll move on to our next scene. So here we move to Act 4, Scene 4. And in the textbook, if you have access to it, it is lines 34 to 67. In other texts, the lines will change slightly. So here, Hamlet is leaving for England. Or my apologies. It is actually line, line 34. 31, sorry. Hamlet is leaving for England. Hamlet is leaving for England, and he is been sent to England after the play shenanigans, after Polonius's death. He's ostensibly being sent to go back to college and kind of cool off for a while, although we know that he's actually being sent to be killed by the English king via Claudius's message through Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. So here's what Hamlet says as he leaves. How all occasions do inform against me, and spur my dull revenge. What is a man if his chief good and market of his time be but to sleep and feed? A beast, no more. Sure, he that made us with such large discourse, looking before and after, gave us not that capability and godlike reason to fusten us unused. Now, whether it be bestial oblivion or some craven scruple of thinking too precisely on the event, a thought which, quartered, hath but one part wisdom and ever 3 parts coward, I do not know why yet I live to say this thing's to do, sith I have cause and will and strength and means to do it. Examples gross as earth exhort me. Witness this army, of such mass and charge, led by a delicate and tender prince, whose spirit with divine ambition puffed makes mouths at the invisible event, exposing what is mortal and unsure to all that fortune, death, and danger dare, even for an eggshell. Rightly, to be great is not to stir without great argument, but greatly to find quarrel in a straw when honor's at the stake. How stand I, then, that have a father killed, a mother stained, excitements of my reason and my blood, and let all sleep, while to my shame I see the imminent death of 20,000 men, that for a fantasy and trick of fame go to their graves like beds, fight for a plot whereon the numbers cannot try the cause, which is not tomb enough and continent to hide the slain. From this time forth my thoughts be bloody or be nothing worth. So here, on Hamlet's way out of town to England, he meets some Norwegian soldiers on their way to fight Poland. Now, they're on their way to fight Poland for some truly worthless territory, and a very small amount of truly worthless territory. Hamlet says, a plot whereon the numbers cannot try the cause, meaning, it's so small that it can't hold the men who are fighting for it. And he says, it's not tomb enough and continent to hide the slain. Like, it's so small that you cannot bury on it the number of men who will die fighting over it. It's so small that you can't actually fit all of the fighters onto this tiny plot of land. So he sees these soldiers who are going to war for a really stupid reason. He sees that like 20,000 people, the imminent death of 20,000 men, are about to die for no good reason. Yet, Hamlet here still compares himself to these men. And specifically, he compares himself to their leader, Fortinbras, who is so much more of the martial archetype than Hamlet says he can ever hope to be. You know, Fortinbras here is taking decisive action. And Hamlet says, Fortinbras has divine ambition and godlike reason. Hamlet says he wants to follow Fortinbras' example regarding taking decisive action, but, our boy is too self-aware for that. Because he points out that these men are taking decisive action. He says, rightly to be great is not to stir without great argument, but greatly to find quarrel in a straw when honor's at the stake. So he's saying that to be a great man is to take decisive action rather than hold back and be too contemplative. Except that he also recognizes that what's happening is that Fortinbras is taking such decisive action that he's being really hasty. He is finding quarrel in a straw. And not only that, Hamlet understands that Fortinbras' decisive action isn't going to produce any good result. It's just going to get 20,000 innocent people killed. So Hamlet is mad at himself for his inaction. He says that his own inaction is, 1 part wisdom and ever 3 parts coward. He says, I get it. Like, I claim in my head to myself sometimes that I am holding back because I'm, being wise, when really I know that mostly I'm just being a coward. So he's really being hard on himself again here. He says, I do not know why I yet live to say this thing's to do, sith I have cause and will and strength and means to do it. He says, I have everything that I need now to do this thing. I have everything I need to avenge my father. I have, the cause to do it, the will, the strength, and the means. I have everything I need. Why won't I just do it? And as he's doing this, he's thinking about Fortinbras and his sort of rash action, and he's saying, Fortinbras is getting a bunch of men killed for no good reason. And he's sitting that next to his thoughts about, I have a really good reason to do this bloody, terrible thing. And I just haven't done it because I'm a coward. And so by putting those two things together, we start to understand that maybe his thoughts are going to a place where, if Fortinbras can get 20,000 people killed over nothing, well, the least I can do is buck up and avenge my father. Perhaps. Because the last line of this is, oh, from this time forth, my thoughts be bloody or be nothing worth. So the real question is, in this moment, what changes do we start to see in Hamlet? Because he's still berating himself for his inaction. And he's still saying, why am I not taking action? But how is the scene different in attitude to the emotions he expresses in to be or not to be? Because he still has that sense of, is death worthwhile? Is death better than life? I do not know why I yet live to say this thing's to do. I don't know why I'm still alive if I won't just do this thing. Why am I still living? He thinks about other people's deaths and their worthless deaths. So compare and contrast in your own head, what you see happening in this scene, especially as contrasted to the to be or not to be scene. So our final scene from this play is Act 4, Scene 7, lines 163 to 184. And this is where Laertes has come home, having learned of his sister's death. Do recall that Ophelia, after Hamlet professed that he did not love her, he ran off, and Ophelia has gone a little bit around the bend, but I would actually like to turn to that section first. So if you will indulge me, a couple pages before this, Ophelia comes into where Laertes and the king and queen and some other folks are hanging out, and she comes in on page 2477, Act 4, Scene 5, line about 150. Ophelia enters, and Laertes is horrified at her seemingly have kind of gone mad. He says, "O heavens, is it possible a young maid's wits should be as mortal as an old man's life?" And then look down at line 171. Ophelia says this, "There's rosemary. That's for remembrance. Pray you, love, remember. And there is pansies. That's for thoughts. There's fennel for you and columbines. There's rue for you, and here's some for me. We may call it herbs of grace of Sundays. You must wear your rue with a difference. There's a daisy. I would give you some violets, but they withered all when my father died. They say he made a good end." So here, Ophelia has seen to, she seems kind of, well, mad. She seems to be mad. And she runs around in this few lines giving flowers to different characters. Now, Shakespeare's plays notoriously contain very few stage directions, but she is giving extremely symbolic flowers to the other characters in the play. Let me break this down for you. So the first thing that Ophelia offers up is rosemary, and she actually says that's for remembrance. And we may think that she's talking about her father, remembering her dead father. And that's true, probably, at least to some degree. But let's continue on. Now, we're not making a mountain out of a molehill here. Elizabethan audiences and Elizabethan folks were really into the language of flowers. They would wear flowers that meant certain things, give each other bouquets made of certain things. This also had a resurgence in the Victorian period. So rosemary is for remembrance, pansies are for thoughts. So, you know, thoughts and prayers. So then she says, there's fennel for you and columbines. Now, presumably, she gives these two flowers to Gertrude. Fennel, in the Elizabethan language of flowers, stands for flattery, and columbines stands for infidelity. You know, cheating on your spouse. She says, there's rue for you and some for me. Rue represents repentance. Even today when we say that we rue something, that means that we regret something. So rue represents repentance or regret. So she's pairing these three things and giving them to Gertrude. Flattery, infidelity, and regret or repentance. This is not an accident. Further, she says, I would give you some violets, but they withered all when my father died. Violets, in the Elizabethan language of flowers, stand for faithfulness, implying that maybe Polonius was the only faithful guy here. This reading is further strengthened when she says, again, presumably to Gertrude, oh, you must wear your rue with a difference. So there's some rue for me, some regret for me, and some regret for you, but our regrets are different. So Ophelia seems like she's gone mad. But if she's gone mad, then it's an extremely cognizant, coherent sort of mad. Because in this language of flowers, she is making a very clear statement about what Gertrude has been up to and how Ophelia feels about that. She is being extremely decisive about her opinions in a way that Hamlet has not been up to this point, even when he was pretending to be mad. So, Ophelia is possibly meant to be read as someone who has kind of gone around the bend a little bit because of her grief. But it's also possible that she has sort of retreated to, a place in herself, in her mind, in her existence, where she is able to be a little bit protected from, the really just wrecking events happening around her, and a place that also offers her a certain element or level of agency that she may not have had access to if she was still considered sane. So later in scene 7, Ophelia goes off again. Her last on-screen line, really is singing a little song, and then she leaves. Last thing she says, and of all Christian souls, I pray God be with you. And that's it. She goes. In the next scene, we learn from Gertrude that Ophelia has died. And this is lines 163 to 184. Here's what Gertrude says. There is a willow, grows aslant a brook, that shows his hoar leaves in the glassy stream. There with fantastic garlands did she come, crowflowers, nettles, daisies, and long purples. The liberal shepherds give a grosser name, but our cold maids do dead men's fingers call them. There, on the pendant boughs her coronet weeds clambered to hang, an envious sliver broke, when down her weedy trophies and herself fell in the weeping brook. Her clothes spread wide, and mermaid-like awhile they bore her up, which time she chanted snatches of old tunes, as one incapable of her own distress, or like a creature native and endued unto that element. But long it could not be, till that her garments, heavy with their drink, pulled the poor wretch from her melodious lay to muddy death. So, this scene's a killer. This scene is phenomenal. The Queen's description of Ophelia's death is so beautiful. In my opinion, it's some of Shakespeare's most tragic lines, because Gertrude is painting this really incredibly beautiful picture of Ophelia. And this moment has been painted so many times and in so many beautiful ways. Like, look up Ophelia painting, you'll see what I mean. But, she's building these garlands, and she falls into the river, and she floats there, mermaid-like, while she's singing songs surrounded by flowers, and eventually her clothes become soaked through, because that's what happens to clothes. They pull her under and she drowns. The flower imagery brings us back to that earlier flower scene, and that reminds us of her agency as well, right? The reference to dead men's fingers, the flower, long purples, when she says shepherds give a grosser name, the name that shepherds give them is related to sexual anatomy. And so there is also this connection with this line to sex and death, which are concepts that we have kind of come back to both in the text overall and also specifically with Ophelia. Think about her scenes with Hamlet, some of the kind of innuendo there. And so we also need to think for a minute about, reliable narrators. Because Gertrude is here not a reliable narrator. Gertrude cannot have been there when Ophelia died. Because if she had been, Ophelia wouldn't have drowned. She's not going to let her, not daughter-in-law, her acquaintance, her household member, she's not going to let Ophelia, float in a river until she drowns. So Gertrude could not have witnessed this with her own eyes. And that's not over-interpreting the text. That is simply to say that Gertrude was not present at Ophelia's death. And so she is painting this picture intentionally. She has decided that this is how she's going to describe Ophelia's death. So she's describing Ophelia's death by painting a picture of an Ophelia who, out of grief or out of intention, has chosen not to try to save her own life. The way that Gertrude speaks of Ophelia's death is as one incapable of her own distress, or like a creature native and endued unto that element. So Gertrude straight out says, it was either that she could not save herself or she was as someone who belongs in water already. And the implication that Gertrude is making is kind of just that it was just a thing that happened. She was gathering flowers, a branch broke, she fell in the water, she drowned, it's just a thing that happened. But we kind of already know, based on the last time we see Ophelia alive, that Ophelia is not fully incapable. She may have a lot going on. She may be a little bit distressed mentally, but she's not fully what we would consider, for the context of the play, mad. And so that really starts begging the question, was Ophelia's death a tragic accident, or was it a choice? And that is not ever to glorify the concept of suicide, but it is possible, a possible reading here is that Ophelia's death was an accident caused by her distraction, her mental distraction as a response to grief. It is also possible that Ophelia's death was caused as a result of Ophelia's desperation or her desperate desire to maintain some kind of agency over her life. So when we go back to the scene with the flowers, she says, you must wear your rue with a difference. She gives herself some rue as well, the flower of repentance. So it's also possible that she is seeing this action of hers as some kind of repentance on her own part. That if this is a choice that she is making rather than just a tragic accident, that perhaps what she is doing is trying to remove herself from this situation entirely, trying to regain some kind of, existence or choice that is outside of the inaction, outside of the murder, outside of the kind of distress that is happening in Elsinore. Obviously, this is not a choice that I personally would agree with. If she's trying to regain agency, I think this is the wrong way to do it. But remember that this is a tragedy. And remember that every character in this story makes terrible decisions. Nobody here is making smart decisions. So if this was a tragic accident, then it is a tragic accident brought on by the sense that, Ophelia kind of has to maintain some kind of agency, and maybe she's doing so by wandering around in the woods. If this was something that was done on purpose, again, it was done as an active, decisive choice to, again, regain some agency, in contrast to Hamlet's indecision. This is also a continuum. You may find that your own opinion lays somewhere in the middle. Maybe she is a little mad. Maybe she kind of knew what she was doing. But either way, this is an incredibly tragic moment. No matter how we interpret this as a moment of female agency, kind of put to tragic purpose, or just a moment expressing kind of the toll that grief can take on a person, either way, it's incredibly sad, it's incredibly beautiful, and it can also function as a turning point for some characters. Because when Gertrude comes in with the news, Laertes and Claudius are already discussing how to kill Hamlet during a duel. The king has just said, I am going to poison your sword and also this wine in case you don't hit him. And it's at that moment that the queen walks in, after he has said this thing. And so after she tells them of Ophelia's death, Laertes is even angrier than he was before. He says, I have such a speech of fire that fain would blaze, but that this folly doubts it. He is incredibly grief-stricken. and incredibly angry at the same time, and those two impulses are warring inside of him now. But he's already agreed to fight Hamlet. He's already mad as heck about this whole murdering his dad thing. And it's at this moment that a lot of people and a lot of adaptations interpret as being kind of the turning point for Gertrude as well, where she starts to recognize that maybe her husband is actually a terrible person who she should not be supporting anymore. That maybe his misdeeds have caused a chain of events that has already led to the death of 2 people and will lead to the death of more if she doesn't intervene. Now, she doesn't intervene, she dies, a lot of other people die, but there is a way to read this scene as a turning point for the characters who are still alive, in addition to being, a commentary on Ophelia's own state of mind before her death. So Claudius, meanwhile, plays this to his advantage, further solidifying him as a completely irredeemable villain at this point. And so again, the main question here is sort of like, do you believe that Ophelia's death was a tragic accident, and to what extent? And secondarily, you can really see this moment as kind of, how do you see it as a turning point for some of the other characters? So these are 5 key scenes from Hamlet, moving from Act 1 through the end of Act 4. Obviously, there is more to this text than just these scenes, but I hope this has helped you understand in some small way kind of how we go about interpreting a Shakespeare play.